I've got 13 of the 10 by 10 cuts out of the 17 that I need, 16 foot long. Now not all of them need to be 16 foot long, but that's what I've got is 16 foot logs, so some of them are going to be 10 foot or something like that, depending on what I figure out there when I get to that point. Anyway, meanwhile, like I said, I got 13 10 by 10s, nice 10 by 10s, as well as some full dimension 2 by 6s, a few 2 by 4s, and some miscellaneous 1 by stuff. But I was having trouble with the mill here, and I was working harder than I needed to on it. So I decided to stop and do a little maintenance on the mill. Now this mill, when I bought it, it was third or fourth owned when I got it. It had been rode hard and put away wet before I ever got it. It took me a while to get it going. When I got it, you couldn't cut a log with it. Figured that out. The main shaft there, the bearings in it were shot, and they'd run it so much that they destroyed the shaft. So I wound up getting a new shaft and bearings and putting in there, and then I changed the sheaves that the blade runs on and got narrower sheaves because we changed the blade operation from a 2-inch blade to an 1.25-inch blade. Well, one of the sheaves was broken. That uses a tapered sleeve in there to hold those bearings or those sheaves on the shaft, and they'd over tightened one of them or didn't tighten it in there properly, and it cracked. One of the hubs of one of the sheaves was cracked on it, so I had to replace it. So I just went ahead and replaced the whole shebang with stuff that more fit the horsepower of this machine, and run it down to an 1.25-inch blades. And a whole new guide rail setup. The guide rail setup that originally came with this was kind of a monstrosity, so this one's a lot better. And then since then I've done a lot of other work to it, maintaining, changing bearings and stuff like that. What it's doing here now is it's not cutting square. You put a log on there and you make your first cut, and then you roll it over 90 degrees in against the stops there and tighten it up on that, and then make the second cut, and then sometimes that doesn't cut perpendicular to the first cut. But what happens then is you roll it again another 90 degrees, and the first cut goes face down on the log deck, and then the third cut is parallel with the first cut. And then the same when you roll it again to the fourth cut, the fourth face, that winds up parallel to the second face. So the logs aren't square, but they weren't too bad. They were easily usable or easily fixable when I run them through the joiner and the planer. But now what I'm getting is the faces aren't running parallel. Nothing's running straight. So when I make the first cut and roll it over to the second cut, that one wasn't perpendicular to the first cut, but then when you'd run it over and lay the first cut down on the deck, then the third cut wasn't parallel with the first cut. So it was winding up with really out of square timber. So on every log what I was having to do was I'd make my first cut, roll it over 90 degrees, and then set the mill forward, put the square on it, and square up the mill to the first cut, so it was square to the first cut, and then make my second cut, and then I'd roll it over again 90 degrees, and then make the third cut, and I'd have to roll the log up and shim it up and make the third cut so it was parallel. And I was getting some good timbers out of it like that, but it winds up being more work than it should be, especially when you got to roll all those over by hand and stuff. And anyway, it's time to do some work on this. This log deck is set up so that you can cut tapered siding, beveled siding, or cut shingles. And what it does is each one of these pieces here that are bolted into the cross members pivots on a bolt. And then there's a shaft that runs through there with tabs welded on it. And I've got the main control off of there because it just gets in the way, so I'm just going to use a wrench to demonstrate it. But when you rotate this shaft, there's a tab there that tips up underneath the bar and raises that whole log deck up at an angle so that you can cut tapered siding or tapered boards. And then so you tip it up one way, and as the cut goes through you get a taper, and then as you tip it down and it goes down, then the second board already has a taper on it, and it runs parallel on the second cut, so you wind up with a tapered bevel on that, or a bevel on that one. But then if you want to cut shingles or shakes, you cut your blocks on there the length that you want and stack them up on there. And there's a tab down there in the middle that you tip this up this way, and that raises the block up. So the back end of the block is raised up off of the front end. It's at an angle, and you cut through and you get a tapered cut, and then you tip it back down again, it flattens out, and you cut shingles that way. Well, that works fine, except that bed is not fixed down. So if you got a log on there or timber on there that's flat on that deck, then that's fine. The weight of it holds it down and it works good. But if you get a wide cant on there that's wider than what that deck is, or a log on there that's not quite centered, that's got the weight on it more on one side than the other, then that picks that up. It tips it because there's nothing to hold it down. This mill was third hand or fourth hand when I got it, and it had been rode hard and put away wet. It had been used and abused when I got it, and then I used the heck out of it, and I loaded, I've cut some pretty doggone big logs on here. Some 20-footers, 16-footers, some up to 36 inches in diameter, some great big logs. And I was using that little PC-30 excavator to load them on there with, and of course it's just not big enough to do that. So sometimes they get dropped on here a little bit. And you see these first two rails here, these first two cross members, well, they were only 2.5-inch channel iron to start with, and they got bent. So I cut those out of there and I replaced them with some 6-inch channel and put everything back together that way. And then the whole thing has been bent up and down there, places on all of that. So anyway, that's the first thing I'm going to do, is I'm going to go through there, and I think I'm going to weld those down. I'm going to cut some shims to stick underneath the edge of those. That's kind of a T-bracket that's on there, that deck. So I'm going to cut some shims to equal length, cut those loose from that bar so that bar gets held down, and shim those up and weld the two on this end, which are the ones that hold this end of the log the most, and then there's another big cross member down there halfway down the log deck. I'll weld that one down solid, and then another one towards the end. And then this log deck is an extra long. It's made for cutting a 20-inch log, so it's got an extra bay down there. That one's welded in solid, so I don't have to deal with that one, but I'll do the farthest one down there that's movable, and then the two on this end and one in the middle, and weld those down solid so I don't have problems with that wandering on me. And then we'll go through and line the whole thing up, so it doesn't really matter whether one side is higher than the other or one end is higher than the other, as long as everything's square. But if one side of one end gets higher than the rest of it, then this thing can rack, and I don't think that's the problem. These side rails on here are 8-inch channel iron, and they're heavy structural iron. It's not just a standard iron, channel iron. It's a heavy duty structural stuff, so this thing is pretty stout. So it's not racked. Even if it was racked, it would just be suspended in the air on one end. So, but anyway, I'm going to go through and square this thing, or flatten this thing up, make sure it's all level, and I know how to do that. I've got this set on some timbers that run the full length. The channel iron is sitting on timbers the full length, and then I got cross ties underneath it every I think 8 feet or so, and it's just about like a railroad track. And I worked as a gandy dancer, section hand and a laborer on the railroad for a little over a year, and one thing I learned was how to straighten out track like that, so I can get this thing all leveled up and straightened out. And then once I get that done, I think the real culprit is the head here, the cutting head of this. I think I'm going to have to adjust this. So this thing runs, it's got a 24-inch hydraulic cylinder on this side that raises this side up and down. Of course, it's got 4 posts on it and 4 wheels it runs on, but it raises up and down on this side, and then it's got a chain bolted in down here on the bottom the frame on this side that runs up inside that post there, or outside of it, I guess, outside the post. Then there's a pulley up there, a gear up there bolted onto the saw frame on this side that runs through the channel and comes out on this other post here through another pulley, and then it's welded on or attached firmly up to that post there. And so if that side is not dropping down as far as this side is, then I need to drop that side, adjust that tension on that chain so that it drops down a little bit more on that side and levels out. Well, anyway, that's the agenda now. It's just getting too much work trying to manhandle those logs there and everything and get them all squared up. So it's time to bite the bullet and start working on this. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is get the grinder out and start grinding on these tabs and stuff, and like I said, loosen a couple of these up so that I can make a nice firm deck on there that's not moving all the time. Make sure that's one problem that's eliminated, one variable that's eliminated from my problem. Well, that was actually step 2, I guess. Somebody had tacked those down before, and the welds were just crappy welds. They didn't penetrate anything or anything. They broke loose. They all came loose. And I was afraid they might be keeping those from going all the way down and stopping on those cross members like they're supposed to. So anyway, I cleaned those up, and I can put a good weld on those to weld those down. Like I said, that's step 2. Step 1 I did yesterday. I cleaned this all out, got all the sawdust and crap out from underneath this thing. It was getting filled up. So we got that cleaned up, all the sawdust, and washed off my wooden rails here on the side and everything. Got those all cleaned up so they get dried out. I guess that was step 1. So this is step 2. I got those ground up. Now what I've got to do first is I got to make some gauge blocks to fit underneath there. Figure out, I think that's supposed to be 2.5 inches between the bottom of the T on that and the top of those rails, those cross members. So I got to make a couple of gauge blocks so I can set one under each side of those, and then I can take those loose from the bolts and cut them off from this bar that goes through there. At least the ones I want to make sure are square. And then I can clean those bars up and stuff, and that deck up, and weld those down. So I got to go find some material to make some gauge blocks out of. I used a cutoff wheel on a 4.5-inch grinder and cut the T-sections there off from the adjustment arm. And I took the bolts out of there that it was pivoting on. I did that on these first 2, the middle one, and the one on the far end of this adjustable deck. I made some shim stock to go underneath there, some gauge blocks to go underneath that to hold it up. So I've got the first one all welded on there. I've got this second one set up with the gauge blocks underneath it, the spacer blocks set up underneath it. I think I'm going to tack that one in, and then I'll move back and do the middle one, and then do the one on the end and get those tacked in. And then I can come back and weld them up. Got those 4 log deck pieces welded down. Thought I was going to run out of duty cycle, but I was able to get it all done. Just stitch welding it here and there. Thought I was just going to tack weld these last 3 down today and then come back and do it again later, a little bit at a time, but I went ahead and welded it down, and it all went fine. I didn't run out of duty cycle on that. The machine never overheated and shut down, so that was good. I did run out of wire there. I just finished up and used up the whole roll of wire. I was going to tack those tabs down on that log deck adjuster for the bevel siding and stuff, and then I decided not to do that. If I want to make bevel siding, I can still just use those 3 pieces on the deck that are there that aren't welded down solids. And that if I want to make shingles or shakes, that's completely separate from the other one, from making the bevel siding that turns the other direction for that. So anyway, I just decided there was no need to tack that down since these 4 deck pieces are welded down solid. Those other ones are going to float. They're not going to tip or anything like they were before, so that shouldn't knock anything out of kilter there. So that much is done, and the day is done. So tomorrow, I don't know how much of a day tomorrow I've got flying. I just got called a few minutes ago to go tomorrow early in the morning, and then possibly a second flight after that. So I don't know how that's going to do for the day tomorrow, and it's possible that the weather's supposed to change and it may start raining. But anyway, the next thing to do is to make sure that this deck is squared up, that everything on it, the whole framework down here is squared up. I'll get that done, and then once that's all squared up, then I'll square the mill head up. Hopefully then I can cut some square lumber without having to manipulate it. Well, I dug my carpenter's level out, and I run it on this rail here on this side, and it looked like it was okay. I run it on the one on the other side, and it was level. But when I ran the cross between this end here, between the two of them, it showed this side quite a bit lower than the other side. Oh, I went and got a 2x4 so I could span that in some different places and went across it. And it's level down underneath the head end, but down on this end it was quite a bit lower on this side, this rail, than it was on the other side. So I cleaned some of the sand from around those ties and jacked it up until it was just, well, just above level. This side just a little bit high, and then I tamped underneath those like they do a railroad tie, packed underneath them good with the sand, and that brought it up level. I let it down, and that's pretty close. This side's just a touch high, but it should settle back down again. I got the machine running right now, and I'm going to run it up and down there, and that should pack everything back down. And checking it all, the length of it, it's pretty good along the length of it. So anyway, this corner was a little bit low. I didn't really expect that, but we got it taken care of. So the next thing I've got to do is check the height of the carriage, the mill carriage against the bed. So we've got the bed all leveled and squared. I wanted to do that, tamp those down. There's always going to be a little bit of a settling. So I'm going to let the machine sit right there idling for a little while. Just let the vibrations work that down and pack it down, make sure it's good and tight. Well, I think we got it all squared away now. I found a piece of, I think that's 2-inch box tubing, and it's something that I'd made up a long time ago. I welded a plate onto it and then put a trailer hitch, a trailer ball on it for towing for a piece of equipment or something. It's been kicking around here for quite a while. So I've got that set on there, and because the trailer hitch portion is heavier, the ball is heavier on this end, it wanted to tip off there, so I just braced it up with that stud that I was going to use in the first place. So I set that up, and then I got these blocks. These are the gauge blocks that I'd made up for setting these plates, these tables up. I just laid that on top of this on that end and brought it down to where it was just barely touching, and then I put it in this end, and sure enough this end was lower, so I raised it up until it slides equally on both sides. So now it's within a cat's whisker of being perfect. Well, hopefully that solves my problems with the mill here running and not cutting square, other than operator error. There's still a couple other variables on here. The log dogs there where they go up, they're not perfectly square. There's still some manipulating to do there, but at least this is better. So that should be that on the mill. Should cut straight now. Get it started up now. I pressure washed everything off and got everything all cleaned up and everything, so the next thing I've got to do is get the grease gun out and re-grease all the bearings and stuff on it. Then we should be good to go again. Cut the first timber after getting the mill all squared up, and it cut pretty good. Made the first face cut and then rolled it over against the dogs there, against the stops, and I had to do a little bit of fiddling with it there to get it squared up, get the second cut squared up. But once I rolled it over on the rest of them onto the deck, it was just perfect. So that turned out pretty good. This log was 14 inches on the top and 20 inches on the butt. And the only thing I got out of it was that one timber. It was a big sweeper. It had a big bow in it, and the butt swept way up in it. You can see I got 8 inches on the butt down here. There it is on that cut on the second cut there, there's where the butt is, there's 8 inches there, and then there's almost nothing in the middle of it, and only about 1.5 inches or so on the top. That last cut was about 4 or 5 inches deep in the middle and right down to the wane on either end. So anyway, I got a timber out of it, and it's a good timber, but there was nothing else out of it but one timber. So, but that's okay. That's one more timber on the pile. Anyway, the mill cuts pretty good so far. Better than it did. I still got to fiddle with it on between that first and second cut, but that's all right. That's better than it was.